Has a narcissist ever told you that you are too self-centered? Or a cheating partner accusing you of sneaking around? If you can relate, let us know in the comments. Today, we're talking about the narcissist's favorite defense mechanism. You guessed it, projection. Did you know that there's more than one type? I'm about to share the two types of projection and uncover exactly what this defense is protecting the narcissist from. They're hiding something even from themselves, and it's probably deeper than you think. Let's get to it. Welcome to the Common Ego community, where we talk about things like emotional abuse recovery and self-development. Today we're talking about projection, and if you've spent any time around a narcissist, you've experienced projection. Of this, I'm sure. So what does projection look like? Well, do you remember that scene at the end of the Titanic where Rose clung to the door to save her from drowning? That's how a narcissist clings to defense mechanisms like projection. Also, in this scenario, I hate to say it, but if you're stuck with a narcissist, you're not Rose, you're Jack. There's no room on this door for you. I know that's harsh, and it's also true. I've been there myself and nearly drowned from the emotional mess because I was suffering from some very toxic hope. I have a video on toxic hope that I'll link to in the card and the description for those of you who may want to learn more. So we've already covered projection as a defense mechanism, and that's a concept that originated with Freud. Freud believed that people use projection to protect themselves from things they can't cope with. Projection is one of many defenses in a narcissist arsenal, but it's by far the most used. And narcissists aren't the only ones who use projection. Really, everyone does. It's just that someone who isn't a narcissist is going to eventually self-reflect and realize they have some healing to do. It may take some time, but most people get there eventually. So if you see someone using projection and it's obvious, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a narcissist. Just pay attention to how they react when you call them out. In the heat of the moment, anyone may continue with the momentum they've built up. But when things calm down, does it seem like they can self-reflect? If so, this is probably the only time you'll deal with that type of projection because now they're aware of it. A narcissist, on the other hand, will double down even after the dust has settled in the argument. It wasn't them, it was you, period. So now we're going to look at the two types of projection that you'll encounter with a narcissist. The first and most common type we talked about in the start of this video. That type is an outright accusation. And this can be an accusation of something the narcissist actually is. For example, a cheater, a narcissist, a gaslighter. Or it could represent a fear of what people think of them. For example, if their biggest fear is that people will think they're poor or a freeloader, whatever it is, they're going to project that onto you. This may be something that's true about you, or it may be completely out of left field. And when it's something off base like that, it's super confusing at first. Once you understand projection, though, it becomes much more obvious. The second type of projection is when the narcissist essentially turns you into them. It's when they knowingly trigger what's known as reactive abuse to make you look like the bad guy. Reactive abuse is what happens when a narcissist pushes a person to the breaking point. We all have one. This is the point where you may act in a way that's completely out of character, and it makes you look like the one who's abusive. But even though it looks abusive on the surface, reactive abuse isn't abuse. As the name implies, it's a reaction to abuse. Still, the behavior itself, the reaction, may not be acceptable, and we're always responsible for our own behavior. But even with that said, the reaction doesn't make you the abusive one. This intentional triggering is a form of projection that you've accepted as your own if you take the bait. And it's also the biggest smoke and mirror show the narcissist can pull off. Unfortunately, because they know your triggers and have you feeling like you're emotionally tethered to them, they're really good at getting you to react. And then, because your reactive behavior is out of character and appears out of control, you end up feeling bad about yourself, don't you? That's the narcissist projecting what they feel upon you. So at the surface, the behavior the narcissist is projecting is obvious. They're cheating, so they accuse you of it. They're abusive, so they're masters at creating situations where they can play the victim and point their finger at you. See, I'm not abusive, you are. We know they're hiding those ugly feelings because those parts of themselves don't support that false persona. But like I said earlier, there's more to it than that. It's not just the behaviors they're hiding from, it's the shame they feel behind it all. Shame is the ugly secret every narcissist is hiding, not just from the world, but also from themselves. One commonly accepted theory is that the narcissist grew up being shamed and humiliated by one or both parents, and possibly on the playground too with bullies. They were shamed for their behavior, their character, and their feelings. And so they learned at a young age that feelings are punished, yet power and control are safe. So the narcissist never learned the tools he or she needed to regulate those negative feelings. And that's the difference between shame a narcissist feels and shame anyone else may feel. The narcissist literally can't handle it. So they push it down as much as they can, and they cultivate a false persona that's free from shame. But that doesn't work. Shame will always bubble up to the surface, and sometimes it can be intense. As adults, narcissists will rage whenever they feel shame. But before, and also during the rage, comes projection. Consider subtle projection like the narcissist's way of maintaining their shame between bouts of rage. And I think shame is probably the most misunderstood emotion. Some people think it's synonymous with guilt. Some people think it's the same as embarrassment. It is neither of those things. I think here's where we should all stop and give some credit to Brené Brown for shining a spotlight on shame. I love the way she frames shame versus embarrassment, and I think it tells us everything we need to know about this dangerous emotion. Here's a quote. "Embarrassment is a feeling of discomfort that often doesn't last very long. What differentiates embarrassment from shame is that when we do something embarrassing, we know we're not the only ones who have done that thing. Shame makes us feel completely alone." And then there's the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is when you feel bad about something you've done. You recognize the behavior as wrong. Shame is when you recognize yourself as wrong. It's the difference between I did something awful and I am awful. Narcissists aren't as likely as the average person to feel guilt or embarrassment, but they very much do experience shame. And because they've never developed the tools to process shame, they treat it as a foreign invader that's threatening their status quo. And what do you do when you're being invaded? You fight. But since they can't fight themselves, the narcissist ends up fighting you. You're the problem, and it's you that should be ashamed of yourself. This will come out in the form of narcissistic rage, and it'll also seep into day-to-day life. If you've ever felt shame, you know that it can be a bit of a roller coaster. Sometimes it's small and manageable, and sometimes it's overwhelming. But you can bet that the level of anger and projection you're experiencing from the narcissist is directly tied to the level of shame they're feeling at any moment. And I can't talk about shame and narcissism without touching on the difference between vulnerable or covert narcissism and grandiose or overt narcissism. We know these types of narcissism exist on a scale, and a vulnerable narcissist may exhibit grandiose tendencies and vice versa. But there's a study that illustrates how the vulnerable narcissist is much more in touch with their shame than the grandiose narcissist. I'll link to it in the description below. And I want to point out that this doesn't necessarily mean that the grandiose narcissist is free from shame, but they're definitely more protected from it. In both cases, if you shame either type of narcissist, expect rage and projection. However, the grandiose narcissist has developed a much stronger false and grandiose self. And you can think of it as a shield of armor. The bullets are still landing, but they don't feel the pain. On the other hand, the vulnerable narcissist, according to research, is much more dependent on external validation. So if, for example, they see a disapproving look from you, they're much more likely than the grandiose narcissist to react. And they'll react with projection and possibly rage. The fact that you aren't validating them in the moment is likely to activate their shame. Whereas a very grandiose narcissist will feel like they're flying so high above you, they may not even notice your disapproving glance. They're much better at validating themselves and aren't at all interested in the opinions of lowly beings. If you do activate a shame response in a grandiose narcissist, it will probably look more like annoyance. Like, how could you think you're worthy of an opinion of them at all? And even though what you're seeing is extreme arrogance, in the moment, they are projecting shame upon you. And they're passing it along like it's a hot potato. Have you ever tried to pick up a potato straight from the oven? It hurts, and you want to get rid of it as soon as you can. It's kind of the same thing with shame and other negative emotions. Okay, so now that we've covered projection and the big secret narcissists are hiding behind their projection, let's talk through the only strategy that works to handle it, and that is to refuse the hot potato. Don't accept what the other person is putting upon you, and don't become reactive. I know it's easier said than done, but as you begin identifying projection, it really gets easier to remain calm. Instead of hearing the words as they're said, understand their true meaning. For example, with projection, the translation for "you should be ashamed of yourself" is "I'm ashamed of myself, and I'm subconsciously projecting it on you because I literally can't handle the shame." Just keep in mind that by the nature of projection, the person projecting has no idea what they're doing. The thing they're projecting is something they've buried so deep that they aren't consciously aware of it. And this is how projection gets to you. The person projecting can be so convincing because they really, really believe with the utmost conviction in what they're saying. Above all, when someone is making you feel a negative emotion, recognize that they're putting that on you and remain calm. It's not always projection per se, but if you can stop yourself from being reactive, it'll be easier to see things for what they really are. And I know this can feel impossible at times because along with projection from a narcissist often comes narcissistic rage. And this can be scary and intimidating. I have a video where I talk about narcissistic rage that you'll experience after you've inflicted a narcissistic injury. And if you found this video helpful, especially if you've dealt with narcissistic rage, click the box right here to watch that video. And as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. These things really help the video and the channel. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you next time.